Andiamo zitti la mano, perché lo stiamo facendo una balla, ma si vede che molla, mi sembra molla, per sapere la si vuole la mattina, quando facciamo la mattina, cosa ci può la mattina,
Welcome to Communicology. I'm Richard Talbert. I'm an associate professor of media and communication. I love studying how people communicate and how communication and the culture of the world intersect. So, on our last discussion with the definition of communicology, we discussed the concept briefly of culture. And I want to get into that a little bit more today because it's a very loaded word and it's a very misunderstood word. But it's actually a very simple word, and we just need to hop into it and talk about it just a little bit so we can understand it as we continue moving forward in our human experience. So today, when I talk about culture, I want to start with a literal translation. And this is not exactly a very, very old term. It comes out of the Middle Ages, and it comes from the Latin from cultura, which is from the concept of agricultural work. So when you think of cultivating a field, there you get the idea. So it's to care, to nurture, and to tend, and also to focus on systematic improvement and refinement. So when you're thinking about a field, if you've ever tried gardening, if you've ever tried growing flowers, or even that potted plant that's dying in the corner of your office or living room, you understand the concept of culture when it comes to cultivating from an agricultural standpoint. Do you care for that plant? Do you nurture that plant? Do you tend to that plant? Do you do systematic improvement and refinement to get it to grow and provide everything it needs to grow? Well, if it's dying, probably not. But that's the fun of it. And hey, we learn all about the created world by getting our hands into that soil and figuring things out. So when we get our hands into the soil of human communication and culture, well, how do we define it then? How do we move from the agricultural to now? And believe it or not, I have a very simple definition. I've been teaching this for 20 years, and my students, if they're watching this, are already yelling at the computer or at their phone the three words that I use to define culture, and that's way of life. It's a very simple definition, because we tend to get so caught up when we say culture, especially in a fragmented world. We start to thinking, oh, you mean like blacks and whites. Well, those are aspects of culture, sure. You mean like men and women? Well, yeah, that's part of it too. Well, do you mean this country like China and this country over here, Vietnam, or this country over here, India, or this one over here, and we start thinking of it that way. And when we think of culture, we tend to want to break it into those chunks at some kind of macro level, instead of stopping and thinking, if I go back to cultura, an individual plant, how do I make that grow? How do I cultivate that? So when I look at culture and I define it as way of life, I look at the idea of how do you live your life? How do you and your group of friends live your lives? Your coworkers and colleagues, your family. When it comes to all those different groups, those different people groups, when they assemble, they do things and they have a way of living, this way of life, and they develop a culture. So that's how I move into that work. So whenever we start thinking of moving the agricultural into the human, we're looking at how do I then nourish, how do I tend to this group, this concept of togetherness that we can then flourish and grow. So that's our concept of way of life. Now, it's very important to understand that culture is very important, because if you don't understand culture or the culture that you're in, you end up having all kinds of clashes and problems. And maybe you've heard the term culture shock when you go into a new culture and it's radically different than you're used to, and it just throws you off guard. We can dig more about that later, but the idea is still there that you need to know culture. You need to understand culture. You can't just assume that everybody has the same cultural beliefs and ideas that you do, because why would they? I mean, again, your family group, you all act and have certain cultural traditions. Your coworkers and colleagues have different cultural traditions. Your church family has different cultural traditions. So they're just different in each place, and you shift and change and adapt to each one. You're not the exact same person, each one, and all those people don't interact to you and adapt to you. They take you in as part of that. And as a group, you cultivate, you tend, you nurture, and become that culture. So why is it so important? Well, first of all, we need to think about how we as human beings crave shared experience collectives. So when we gather together with a group, you don't go jump into a group of people who are diametrically opposed to what you believe, or maybe you have certain interests, so you go together with someone who doesn't have those same interests. That creates all kinds of problems, obviously, because, well, what do you have in common? And you end up having disagreements and fights and all kinds of problems like that. So what we do when we gather together as groups, we look for like-minded people. That's just common. What do we have? What's our shared interests, our shared beliefs? I happen to like, baseball. So I get together with other people who like baseball. So then we can talk about baseball together. And maybe that's not specific enough. Maybe we want to talk about a specific team. And we talk about that. And that's our way of collecting and the way that we act and gather together. Or maybe we have a certain religious belief. We look at all the different denominations that there are across the United States, across the globe. Why are there so many different denominations? Well, some people have different core beliefs. How do you baptize people? Do you do it when they're children? Do you do it when they're adults and can make their own profession of faith? Again, those are just different things that we choose to collectively gather with. And if you get with people who are diametrically opposed to what you believe in, it's not going to go well. And that's when we have lots of infighting and you see schisms happen where people just separate. So you have people who believe one thing go one way, people believe another thing go another way. There we go. And then those people then form their new group and their new culture, and this group forms their new beliefs and their new cultures. And sometimes you have major fractions where you have several groups split into different directions, and they all form their own little different groups. That's the nature of humanity. That's how we end up doing things, because we have different ways of rationalizing through things, different ways of emoting and feeling through things, and we then tend to collectively gravitate towards people who are similar. Because people don't care for conflict. They don't want to find more conflict. Like, I just got done fighting with this guy, so I'm going to gather with this guy and fight with him too. That doesn't make sense. So what we end up doing is we find the people who we get together with. Also, quite frankly, we're creatures of habit and creatures of comfort. We like things easy, and we like things simple. We like things orderly. So when we get together, we want to be able to say, I know this group of people. I know what they like. I know what they believe in. I like them. They make things simple for me. They help me out when I'm in need. I help them out when they're in need. And it works. We like that. I mean, we as human beings like that. Very rarely do you have someone who says, I thrive on chaos. Even people who are saying that they're the most free-spirited people and they love just going with the flow and whatever happens, happens. Even they like order and logic, because ask them to drive down the wrong side of the road and you'll find out real quick that actually they do like some kind of constraints. They don't want to be as free-spirited as they say they are. So as a result, we like comfort. We like order. So when we gather together with people, we do that with groups of people where we find that comfort and order. And then again, back to the agricultural definition, we try to cultivate that. So when there is conflict, we try to figure out how can we smooth it out so we can keep and maintain the order that we have. And then the third thing is it gives us identity. No one likes floating through the universe feeling like they don't know who they are. So we tend to latch on to people who seem to have the same beliefs that we do and have the same ideas that we do and the same goals that we do, the same aspirations and dreams and religious beliefs and everything that we all have together. And we then collectively gather together and we enjoy that time in fellowship. But we also do that because we now know I have a people group. I am a person that belongs somewhere. And that's a very comforting thing, because feeling alone is a terrible thing. Even people who are isolationist at some point can't stand it, because otherwise, you'd have a lot of people living in a shack in the middle of Montana instead of eventually coming together with other people and having some kind of fellowship. Very few people can find absolute isolationism and enjoy it. Most people like to have others around, even if it's a short period of time and then they get a break and back off. People still like to enjoy having some kind of fellowship with other people. So we like that identity. So again, we like to gather through shared experiences. We like habit and comfort. And we like to have some kind of identity. So however we identify, and that's the thing that where we tend to put ourselves in that kind of culture, and how we then, claim some kind of way of life. Now, so how does culture start? I mean, where does it begin? How do we create culture? Well, that's a great question, because quite frankly, you don't think too often of a time when we just created a culture. Usually you merge into one that's already there, and you either adapt and adopt, or you back away and leave and go find some other culture that matches what you believe and what you think and what you feel. So there's usually an existing culture that you merge into. So think of like when you get a new job, you go into that culture. Well, that culture exists, but before you started, it existed, and it's going to exist after you leave. Maybe you go off to college. Well, you left the culture of your high school, and then now you're in the culture of that college. It already exists. It was there before you. It'll be there after you leave. So, well, is there ever a time a culture is created? Yes, because we do start new things, like when you go to college and you find a bunch of other like-minded freshmen who say, wait a minute, we're all here together, this crazy new place that we don't understand yet. We're excited, we're happy, also scared, nervous, but I don't know where I am. I don't know these people. So you find someone who believes what you believe in, someone you believe, this other person, and you form a new group. You have this new college friend group. That's brand new, because the group of you never existed before. And now you're together trying to go through. And again, you have a shared experience in that we're all freshmen, we're lost, we don't know what we're doing. Help! So you have that kind of fun of trying to figure that out. But you have this shared experience, and you figure out, wow, you also believe the same things I do, and you, and then you start to coalesce, and you hang out more, and you go to lunch, and you go to lunch every day, and then even dinner, and then you study together. And next thing you know, you're going hanging out and going to the park, going to the movies, going wherever together, just doing together things. Boom, you've created a culture. You've created a way of life, the way that you do things. And then you work to nourish that, to make sure that it is tended to, that it's growing, that it's healthy, and that it's flourishing. So that's what you do with your culture that you have created. Same thing if you are hired at a place of employment. Maybe there are a bunch of other new people who are there, or maybe you are that one key piece that brings these other people together. Maybe you're the kind of person who enjoys something new and exciting, and you have this one thought, and these other people have never had any way of connecting those together. Well, you're that one person who knows, hey, let's connect all these things together. That's an important thing. So now you have that, and you're that one connective tissue. You've created this new group. Now you create this culture. So again, that's a good, easy way to think about how we create culture. But typically, it exists before we ever got there, and that's just what we have to deal with. The interesting thing is when we try to change culture, that's a painful time. If you ever try to change culture, that's painful, because there are a lot of times people will go to a new job, or they'll go to college, and they'll say, I'm going to be the one that changes this place. Really? You. One person against however many decades or centuries of tradition, you're going to be the one to change it. Good luck. I mean, it's possible, but not very common. Typically, it ends up changing us, or we keep hitting that wall until we finally get to the point of saying, I'm tired of fighting. I'm going to either adopt the current culture, or I'm going to jettison and head off to something else. Think about the idea of whenever a sports team isn't doing well, and then it's time to fire the coach. So the coach is gone, and here comes a new coach. Or it could be a situation where a coach gets a better offer somewhere else and just leaves, and now we need a new coach. Think about how much change happens in that time. You hear a lot about how a coach goes in and says, I'm going to put my thumbprint on this program. I'm going to change things. And they try and they meet a lot of resistance, and it's usually a train wreck for a while. Get a load of this number, 7 years. That is the time that it's projected to take somebody who's a new coach, a new teacher, a new boss, to basically be in charge of the culture. 7 years. Why does it take so long? Well, one, again, we're creatures of habit, but also it takes time to implement your vision and your hopes and your dreams and to get buy-in. And the people who are right there immediately at that time that person comes in, the ones who hate the change, the ones who liked it the old way that we used to do it, kind of a thing, well, they're still there, but they eventually retire, quit, graduate, wherever the situation happens to be. They eventually leave, and the next group comes up, and they're the senior group. They still remember some of the good old days, and then they eventually move on in the next group. And meanwhile, you have all these other new people who are coming in on the back end, the newer people who don't know any different. So it takes about 7 years to get that filing through to where the person who's now the senior is the one who was the freshman years ago and has no recollection of the good old days or the way we used to do it. So it takes about 7 years before all the rumors and all of the innuendo and all the remnants of the past get to fade away, and it's truly your program. About 7 years. It can be done faster, but it's typically about 7 years. The biggest way for it to go faster is in a situation where you have a situation where, like, the team that does really, really poorly, and everyone knows they're really poor, everyone hates the head coach is gone, they bring in the new coach, and that new coach is very charismatic and has a great vision, everyone buys into the vision, everyone works to change, then you can have it quicker because everyone's buying into the change. The big downside with that, of course, is whenever you hit a wall and there's that first mistake and people start to question, is this the right person for the job? So it could still take a while. It might not take 7, it might take 4 years, but it's still going to take a while. That's just the difficulty of changing culture. We like comfort. Even if we don't like the comfort, we still like comfort. We don't like when things change. So that's important to be thinking about whenever you're trying to change culture. But again, it's really important to understand that culture is everywhere. It's something that we very much need and appreciate. Think about your family unit. When you have Thanksgiving, you sit down at the table. Who sits where? Is it the head of the family, grandpa or dad who sits at one end, and mom sits at the other end, or grandma at the other end, and then everyone else fills out in the middle? Or does grandma sit to the right hand of grandpa? Why would they do that? Why not sit at the other end? Well, they have their own traditions. And then there's the kids' table. Maybe you've been stuck at the kids' table before. Maybe you're still there. I don't know, depending on how old you are, right? And you're sitting there, and the conversation is different than at the main table. The behavior is different than at the main table. The food sometimes is different than at the main table. But someday the senior person at this table is going to move to this table. What does it take to move to this table? There has to be a change in the culture. Someone has to move away or pass on, and then there's an open seat. And then someone moves from here to here, and children are born and raised, and they populate the kids' table. So again, those are cultural things that we see in families. Christmas time. Do you celebrate Christmas or do you not celebrate Christmas? If you do celebrate Christmas, when do you open presents? On Christmas Eve or Christmas Day? Do you get to open one present on Christmas Eve, then open the rest on Christmas Day? Everyone has different traditions that happens within the culture of their families. So we can see clearly that we are surrounded by culture. We can't change it. We can't change it. We can change it with a lot of effort and work. But realistically, we're a single person. We need to have buy-in to make changes. But cultures exist because it is a way of life. It's a way of doing things, and we enjoy the structure. We enjoy the comfort of the way things are done. So we tend to associate in groups, which have like-minded thoughts and beliefs and opinions. That's why a lot of groups and cultures look the same or sound the same because a lot of times they are the same in that way that they think through things. So that's very important. Whenever you move forward and you start using the word culture, think of the simple definition, way of life. It's not some big nebulous thing that's scary and weird and hard to figure out. It's just a way of life. So think of that when you move forward and focus on culture. Thank you very much for tuning in today. I appreciate you listening. And if you would, please like and share and subscribe. And if you didn't like what you heard, thanks for staying with me this long. And we'll catch you next time on Communicology. Thanks.